March 3, 1838. The courthouse in Henrico County, Virginia, stood heavy with heat and silence that morning. The crowd had gathered not for justice, but for spectacle. On the docket, beneath cases of property and trespass, sat one entry scrawled in fading ink: sale of one Elara Mae, value 15 cents. No one laughed. No one questioned it. 15 cents wasn't a bargain. It was an insult, a message, a punishment crafted not for profit, but humiliation. The men who filled that courtroom knew exactly what they were witnessing: a master's revenge and the law's obedience. They said Elara Mae could read, that she'd been taught the book of Exodus by her lover, a blacksmith named Ezekiel Turner, and that was her crime. She stood at the front, wrists bound by coarse rope, belly swollen beneath a faded muslin dress. Her eyes were calm, not defiant, not pleading, just calm, as though she were staring through time itself. The clerk cleared his throat. Lot number 31, one female, age 23, expecting, literate. He hesitated on the last word, as if it burned his tongue. At the back of the room, Josiah Caldwell adjusted his collar. The plantation master's expression carried a satisfaction colder than steel. Beside him, Reverend Amos Blythe, the county preacher, folded his hands and murmured something that might have been a prayer or a curse. When the gavel struck, the sound cracked through the room like a rifle shot. The sale was done. 15 cents, paid in copper. Elara didn't flinch. Her gaze lifted toward the courthouse window, where sunlight fell in dusty streaks across the wood. The air seemed to tighten. One woman fainted. Another whispered, "The Lord have mercy." Later they would say the parchment that recorded her sale was strange, too thin, too brittle, as if the ink itself had refused to dry. Within a year, 2 of the men who signed that page would be dead. The third would spend the rest of his life hearing her voice in his house, soft, patient, whispering scripture from the dark. Before I take you deeper into the story of what happened in Henrico County that year, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, because these are the stories pulled from the darkest corners of our history, where truth and terror are often the same thing. And leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, your city, your state, your country. I want to know just how far these voices from the past can still be heard. Now, let me tell you about the woman sold for 15 cents and the curse that justice itself carried for 100 years. The Caldwell Plantation stretched across 300 acres of red Virginia clay, its fences like ribs holding the land in place. In early spring, the fields were restless, a mix of mud, memory, and sweat. Down by the smokehouse, the sound of hammers rose and fell in rhythm, metal striking metal, as Ezekiel Turner shaped horseshoes for the coming season. From the kitchen window of the big house, Elara Mae could hear the clang echo through the trees. She paused while scrubbing the stone floor, her swollen belly pressing gently against her apron, and for a brief second she allowed herself to smile. It was the only sound in her days that didn't belong to someone else. Ezekiel had been on the Caldwell property for 6 years, quiet, steady, with eyes that saw more than he ever said. He was trusted enough to work alone, which made him dangerous in ways the master didn't understand. Every Sunday evening, when the work was done and the overseer's boots had faded down the road, Ezekiel would carve letters into small chips of wood and slip them beneath the roots of the sycamore tree near the quarter cabins. It was there Elara found them, small pieces of forbidden knowledge, an alphabet, a verse, a name. At first she thought it was witchcraft, but when she traced the shapes with her fingers and Ezekiel whispered, "It's how they write their laws," something stirred inside her that no chain could bind. Over weeks she learned to recognize the words deliverance, mercy, freedom. Words the preacher never read aloud from the pulpit. They spoke in whispers, always careful, always watching. He taught her to read from a torn page of an old Bible he'd hidden in a tobacco sack. The page came from Exodus, the story of Moses and Pharaoh. "It's about the same thing," he said quietly, "just different names." Elara laughed once, a sound Ezekiel swore was strong enough to split a curse. But that laughter didn't last long. One night, The wind shifted, carrying voices from the big house. Josiah Caldwell's son, Thomas, had seen her lingering by the sycamore after dark. He told his father she was conjuring. The word spread fast, carried by fear and gossip, until even the preacher muttered it from the pulpit, that the devil had taken hold of a woman who thought she could read. From that day, every step Elara took was shadowed. The mistress of the house refused to let her handle food. Children crossed themselves when she passed. Ezekiel avoided her in daylight, not out of shame, but survival. And yet, every night, when the moon hung low and the air turned still, a faint tapping could be heard near the sycamore tree, 3 knocks, slow and steady. It was how they said, "I'm still here." The discovery came one morning in late April, when the air smelled of wet earth and judgment. Josiah Caldwell stood at his dining table, a folded scrap of paper trembling between his fingers. It was small, barely the size of a palm, but its words were written clear and steady, not the clumsy marks of a child, but deliberate, learned letters. It read, "The Lord deliver his people out of bondage." He didn't need to ask who wrote it. The handwriting was foreign, yet familiar in its defiance. Only one person on his estate could have dared to write those words. The overseer, Harlan Pike, shifted uneasily in the corner. "Found it by the quarters," he muttered. "Under that big sycamore." Caldwell's face hardened, his jaw grinding like millstone. He folded the paper twice and tucked it into his vest. The act was slow, ceremonial, as though he were handling evidence of blasphemy itself. "Reading," he said finally, the word rasping out like a cough. "That's how it begins. One learns letters, then questions orders, then the whole foundation crumbles." The house fell silent, except for the soft clatter of his spoon against the table. He turned to Pike. "Bring the preacher." Tonight, that evening, the torches were lit early. The plantation workers were gathered outside the barn, shadows stretched long against the dirt. Reverend Amos Blythe arrived in his black coat, Bible pressed to his chest. His sermons were famous across 3 counties, not for their grace, but for their cruelty disguised as devotion. Caldwell handed him the scrap of paper without a word. The preacher read it once, then again, his lips twitching. "Witchcraft," he whispered, the serpent's voice hiding in scripture. "It starts with a woman. Always Elara Mae was brought forward, her wrists bound. She did not kneel, she did not speak. When Caldwell demanded she name the man who taught her, she simply looked at him with quiet, steady eyes, the kind that make powerful men feel small." The preacher raised his voice. "She must be corrected before her sin infects the others." Caldwell nodded. His decision came as calm as evening rain. "Tomorrow we go to Henrico. I'll see to it she's punished proper, in the eyes of the law." There was a pause, then low murmurs. The law. It gave men like Caldwell permission to twist mercy into property. That night, Ezekiel stood at the edge of the field, watching the lanterns in the big house flicker out one by one. In his hands, he still held the stump of charcoal they'd used to trace words in the dirt. He crushed it slowly, black dust running through his fingers like ash. He knew then something had ended. Something had begun. The next morning dawned cold and grey, the kind of chill that crept through the seams of brick and bone alike. The courthouse bell rang just after 10, summoning merchants, farmers, and idle men who had come not for justice, but for spectacle. Word had spread through Henrico County like wildfire that a literate slave woman was to be sold for 15 cents. Among the crowd was Evelyn Hartwell, a widow from Richmond whose mourning clothes had begun to fade from black to grey. She had come to deliver a petition regarding her late husband's land dispute, but as she stepped through the courthouse doors, the hum of voices drew her toward the auction room like a current pulling her out to sea. The air was thick with sweat, tobacco smoke, and something colder. Anticipation. Men joked softly under their breath, but none dared laugh too loudly. There was an unease about this sale, something that clung to the walls like mildew. When the clerk called her name, Elara Mae, Evelyn felt a stillness descend. The woman who stepped forward was young, heavy with child, her wrists bound loosely as though no one feared she would run. Her face was calm, but her eyes, There was something in them that made Evelyn's throat tighten, a quiet kind of knowing. The bidding began and ended almost at once. Josiah Caldwell himself raised his hand. The gavel came down, sealing Elara's fate for a price too small to buy a cup of coffee, 15 cents. Evelyn couldn't look away. Something inside her shifted, not pity, not charity, but outrage. She had seen cruelty before, in the factories, in the fields, in the silent faces of the enslaved who served her tea. But this was different. This was deliberate humiliation wrapped in the language of legality. After the sale, the men drifted out in clusters, murmuring about crops and weather as though nothing had happened. Caldwell lingered, signing papers, the preacher at his side whispering scripture like an executioner's prayer. Evelyn watched from the doorway as Elara was led away, her chains rattling softly against the courthouse floor. 15 cents, she whispered to herself. The law gave her a price. That night, she couldn't sleep. The image of that parchment, the ink, the seal, the trembling clerk's hand, burned behind her eyes. Her husband had once told her that law was the foundation of civilization. Yet, as she replayed the scene in her mind, she saw only rot beneath the marble. Outside, thunder rolled across the fields, and in the dark, a strange thought took root in her heart. If law could damn a woman for learning to read, then perhaps sin was the only path left to righteousness. The wagon that carried Elara Mae away rattled down a dirt road bordered by bare trees and silence. A single lantern swung from the driver's seat, its flame bending with each bump, casting thin light over the road that led nowhere good. The man driving her, Silas Boone, a tenant farmer with more debts than land, kept his eyes fixed forward. He hadn't bought her for labor. He'd bought her to settle a favor owed to Josiah Caldwell. They arrived before dawn. Boone's house sat crooked against the horizon, its shutters hanging like broken eyelids. Inside it smelled of mold, whiskey, and loneliness. He unbound her wrists, but left the rope nearby, a warning more than a kindness. "You do what's told," he said gruffly, "and you'll keep breath in you till spring." Elara nodded once, saying nothing. She had long since learned that silence was safer than truth. He pointed her toward a narrow cot near the hearth. "You'll sleep there. Work when the light comes." He turned away, muttering about debts and devils, and before long his snoring filled the house. That first night, the wind hissed through the cracks in the boards like whispers. She lay awake, listening, her hand resting on her belly. The baby stirred, a faint flutter beneath her ribs, reminding her she was not entirely alone. Days passed in a blur of chores. She scrubbed floors, carried water, mended torn clothes. Boone rarely spoke except to bark orders, yet something in him was unsteady. He drank more each evening, muttering about eyes in the walls and a song he couldn't stop hearing. By the 7th night, he refused to enter the front room at all. When Elara asked if he was ill, he glared at her with the fear of a man who'd already seen his own death. "You keep your prayers to yourself," he hissed. "I know what you are." The next morning, the door to his room was open, the bed empty. Outside, in the yard, they found him hanging from the apple tree, his face turned toward the rising sun, lips curled as if still whispering. Neighbors said he'd been sick with guilt. That drink had taken his mind. But one old woman swore she'd heard singing that night, soft and low, the same hymn Elara had hummed while washing clothes by the creek. Caldwell received the news 3 days later by courier. The letter was brief. Boone found dead. The woman remains. Suggest removal. He folded it slowly, feeling the sweat gather at his temples. From that day on, strange sounds began to echo through his house, the soft tapping of knuckles on wood, like someone asking to be let in. And every night, just before dawn, the air in his study filled with the faint smell of rain and ashes. Evelyn Hartwell returned to the Caldwell estate 3 weeks after the sale, under the guise of charity. She carried a wicker basket filled with linens and bread, her gloves buttoned to the wrist, her voice rehearsed to sound casual. But her heart beat with a strange and heavy rhythm, not of sympathy, but of reckoning. The plantation gates groaned as she passed through. The fields, still bare from winter, seemed to breathe a kind of quiet warning. Near the main house, workers moved in silence. When they looked up, their eyes slid away quickly, as if meeting hers would invite trouble. Caldwell greeted her with feigned warmth, his voice steeped in the honey of southern civility. "Mrs. Hartwell," he drawled, "you honor my home. To what do we owe the pleasure?" "I came to deliver a few comforts," she said evenly, "for the women on your property. I know how hard these months can be." He smiled without showing his teeth. "Charity is well and good, though I find pity to be the most dangerous form of pride." His eyes lingered on her basket. "And I assure you, my household lacks for nothing." Behind him, the preacher, Reverend Blythe, stood like a shadow made of starch and scripture. He nodded once in greeting, his thin lips curling. "The Lord blesses good women, Mrs. Hartwell, and he punishes curiosity." Their words were sharp enough to draw blood. Evelyn lowered her eyes, forcing herself to smile, and excused herself to the quarters. She found Elara near the wash basin, wrists raw, eyes hollow but unbroken. The sight of her made Evelyn's throat close. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then, softly, Evelyn said, "I saw you that day." Elara looked up. "I remember." Her voice was calm, but beneath it lived something vast: sorrow, faith, fire. Evelyn reached into her basket and pulled out a folded page from an old hymnal. "You can read this," she whispered, glancing toward the door. Elara hesitated, then nodded. Her fingers brushed the page, trembling. Only a little. From outside came the steady ring of a hammer against iron. Ezekiel. His rhythm was unmistakable, a sound like a heartbeat buried in the soil. Evelyn followed the sound later that evening and found him by the forge, his face lit red by flame. "You taught her," she said quietly. He looked up, startled, then wary. "And if I did? Then you've given her something no man can take." Their eyes met. An understanding passed between them, born of guilt and courage both, the kind that could destroy them if spoken aloud. That night, as Evelyn rode back to Richmond, she couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen had taken root, not in the soil, but in the conscience of every soul who'd witnessed that sale. And conscience, once awakened, was the one thing even God's law couldn't chain. By mid-May, the air over Henrico turned thick and restless, the kind of heat that pressed on the skin like an unspoken warning. The days grew longer, the nights shorter, and every sound seemed to linger a little too long after it was made. Beneath that heavy sky, Evelyn Hartwell and Ezekiel Turner began their quiet conspiracy. It started with a single idea whispered between them near the forge, where the hiss of molten iron drowned out dangerous words. "A forged deed of freedom," Evelyn said, her voice trembling more from conviction than fear. "If the law can damn her with paper, perhaps we can save her with it." Ezekiel wiped the sweat from his brow. "You could hang for that." "So could you," she replied, meeting his eyes. "But you already are, aren't you?" Just slower. That night, by candlelight, she brought out her late husband's old stationery, thick, official parchment marked with faint water seals of the Virginia court. Her hands shook as she dipped the quill. The language came easily to her. She'd spent years writing petitions and receipts, letters and condolences, but never before had her ink been so heavy. The document read, "Let it be known that Elara Mae, hereby and henceforth, is recognized as free woman by act of manumission, witnessed and sealed by the hand of Josiah Caldwell." The signature, when she finished it, was perfect. The loop of the J, the slant of the S, every detail practiced until her hand ached. Ezekiel stared at it as though he were seeing a doorway appear where none had existed. "Will it work?" he asked. "It only has to work long enough," she said. For 3 nights they planned. Elara was to leave under cover of a storm, when the roads turned to mud and sound carried poorly. A sympathetic ferryman, bought with what little silver Evelyn owned, would take her and the unborn child across the river to a safe farm in the north of the county. The night they chose came with thunder. Wind bent the trees low, the air full of lightning and promise. Evelyn met them near the sycamore tree where the first letters had once been carved. Elara clutched the parchment against her chest, her dress soaked, her face glowing with both terror and hope. "Go," Evelyn urged, "before the dawn." But they never reached the river. A lantern flared through the darkness, Harlan Pike, the overseer, his rifle glinting with rain. "Stop where you are!" he bellowed. Ezekiel stepped forward, shielding Elara. "You'll have to kill me first." The gun fired once. The sound tore the night apart. Elara screamed his name, her cry swallowed by the thunder. When the smoke cleared, Ezekiel was gone, vanished into the storm, leaving only the parchment behind, soaked and unreadable in the rain. The storm raged until morning, tearing branches from trees and flooding the low fields. By the time dawn bled into grey light, the plantation looked as if heaven itself had tried to wash it clean, and failed. In the cabin nearest the quarters, Elara Mae lay on the dirt floor, her dress clinging to her skin, her hands slick with blood and rainwater. The contractions came hard, relentless, like waves breaking on stone. Beside her knelt Evelyn Hartwell, her hair soaked, her skirts heavy with mud. She had ridden through the storm after the gunshot, praying she was not too late. "Breathe, Elara," she whispered. "You have to breathe." Elara's voice came in gasps. "He's gone," she cried. "They took him." "I know," Evelyn murmured, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. "But he'd want you to live." "You hear me? He'd want you to live." Lightning flashed outside, painting the cabin walls white. The smell of iron filled the air. Elara bit down on her sleeve, stifling a scream that might have carried to the big house. After hours that felt like days, the sound changed. A weak, thin cry, small and trembling, but alive. Evelyn lifted the infant into the dim light. "It's a girl," she said softly, tears streaking the dirt on her cheeks. "You did it, Elara. You did it." Elara reached out, trembling. "Her name. Grace." The baby's tiny hand curled around her finger, warm and impossibly light. For a moment, the world seemed still. No law, no chains, just breath and heartbeat. But the stillness didn't last. A knock rattled the door, sharp, deliberate. Evelyn froze, her hand instinctively moving to shield the child. Harlan Pike stood outside, rain dripping from his hat. His voice came low through the wood. "Mrs. Hartwell, you best step aside. The master's orders are clear." Evelyn's throat went dry. "The woman's just given birth," she said, forcing steadiness into her tone. "You'll not disturb her now." Pike's hand slammed against the door. "That child ain't hers no more. Caldwell wants it sold. Says the devil breeds quick in sinners." Evelyn's eyes went wide. "She'll die if you touch her." The door creaked open an inch. Pike's face appeared in the sliver of light, pale and expressionless. "Then I reckon that's her business, not mine." He left, his boots crunching through wet gravel. The echo lingered long after he was gone. Elara lay motionless, eyes glazed with exhaustion. "He'll take her," she whispered. "He'll take my baby." Evelyn looked down at the tiny face pressed against Elara's breast, so fragile, so new. "No," she said, her voice hardening. "He won't. Not while I still draw breath." Outside, thunder rolled again, distant now, but heavy, as if the sky itself had heard her vow. 3 nights later, the fields lay drenched beneath a pale, reluctant moon. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the mud and broken branches scattered across the land. Evelyn Hartwell rode back to the quarters under cover of darkness, her cloak drawn tight, her pulse loud in her ears. She carried no basket this time, only a small bundle wrapped in white linen and a decision she could never undo. Inside the cabin, Elara Mae sat propped against the wall, her strength barely returned, the baby at her breast. The child's cries were soft, uncertain, as though she too understood the danger around her. Evelyn knelt beside them, her candle light trembling. "It has to be tonight," she whispered. "The roads are empty, and the ferryman's waiting by the bridge." Elara shook her head weakly. "I can't leave her." "You must," Evelyn urged. "If you stay, Caldwell will take her. He's already sent word to the trader in Petersburg. He means to sell her before the week's end. Elara's lips trembled. She's all I have left of him. Evelyn took her hand. And that's why she has to live free. The baby stirred, letting out a faint, plaintive wail. Evelyn unwrapped the linen enough to press a silver cross into the folds, the last belonging from her husband, once meant for their unborn child. "Her name is Grace," she said. "Let her carry faith where we could not." Outside, footsteps crunched over gravel. Both women froze. From the shadows emerged Ezekiel Turner, gaunt, soaked, eyes wild from days in hiding. His clothes were torn, blood dried across one sleeve. "They think I'm dead," he rasped. "That's the only reason I'm breathing." Elara gasped, tears spilling down her cheeks. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pressed his forehead to hers. "I came back," he whispered. "I ain't leaving without her." Evelyn stood, her hands shaking. "There's no time for goodbyes." "The ferryman will not wait past midnight." Ezekiel took the baby gently, his rough hands trembling as if holding a piece of heaven. "I'll take her north," he said, "to the river, then to freedom. I swore to protect her, and I will." He turned to Evelyn. "You've done more than any of us deserved." She looked at him, her eyes shining with quiet sorrow. "Do something worthy with that mercy, Mr. Turner. Don't waste it on vengeance." He nodded once. Then he was gone into the darkness, the sound of his boots swallowed by the night. Minutes later, the cabin door burst open. Reverend Amos Blythe stood there, his eyes gleaming like coals. "The Lord sees all, Mrs. Hartwell," he said softly, "even what you hide beneath his name." Evelyn stepped between him and Elara, her voice steady despite the fear burning inside her. "Then let him judge me himself." Sunday morning came dressed in stillness. The rain had ceased, but the ground still bled with it. The air hung thick and heavy over the Caldwell plantation, and the church bell tolled slow, each note dragging like a burden too heavy to carry. Inside the small chapel, the pews overflowed. Men came in their best coats, women in veils, children clutching worn hymn books with trembling fingers. The preacher's voice had called them early. Reverend Amos Blythe promised a sermon for the salvation of souls. But what they received was a reckoning. He stood before the congregation, tall and skeletal in his black coat, eyes burning beneath the flicker of oil lamps. His voice cut through the hush like a blade. "The wages of sin," he began, "are not always paid in silver. Sometimes the Lord demands a soul for a soul." He paused, letting his gaze sweep the room, resting for a heartbeat too long on Evelyn Hartwell. She sat near the back, her hat brim low, her gloved hands twisting in her lap. The baby was gone, carried to safety she could only pray existed, but Blythe's stare made her wonder if heaven itself was watching. "The devil," he thundered, "has found his way into our homes, into our fields, into the hearts of women who forget their place and men who forget their chains, and the Lord will not stand for it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mothers pulled their children close. Even Josiah Caldwell, seated near the front, looked uneasy, not from guilt, but from the feeling that the preacher's rage might one day turn on him too. Blythe's hand slammed against the pulpit. "I speak now of corruption. A woman who dares read the sacred word without sanction, and those who aid her sin. This is not charity, it is rebellion against God's design." The room erupted with whispers. Evelyn felt every eye turn her way, though no one spoke her name. The preacher's words dripped venom and fear, twisting faith into weaponry. When the service ended, the crowd filed out in silence, faces pale beneath the morning sun. Evelyn rose to leave, but Blythe's hand clamped onto her wrist. His voice dropped to a hiss. "The Lord told me in prayer last night that he would reveal the serpent among us. You cannot hide what you've done." Evelyn met his gaze, her composure brittle but unbroken. "Then perhaps the Lord should come himself," she said softly, "because I no longer answer to his messenger." She pulled free, leaving the church before he could reply. Outside, the air felt colder. Behind her, the hymn of repentance began, dozens of voices trembling together, yet somehow hollow, as though even faith had begun to question itself. Back at the estate, Josiah Caldwell poured himself whiskey for breakfast, his hands unsteady. In the quiet of his study, a new sound filled the air. Soft singing, from nowhere and everywhere, the same hymn Elara had once hummed while folding linen by the fire. The glass slipped from his hand and shattered. The days that followed felt like the world itself was holding its breath. The fields went untended, the workers moved in silence, and every door in the Caldwell house seemed to creak with whispers. The master had locked himself away, claiming illness, though the servants said it wasn't fever that plagued him, but voices. They swore he spoke to the walls at night, arguing, pleading, weeping. Evelyn Hartwell returned under pretense of settling debts for her late husband. In truth, she came for what she knew Josiah Caldwell hid: the records, the ledgers, the proof of what he'd done. The courthouse had its laws, the church had its sins, but both, she knew now, were kept alive by paper. Paper that damned or delivered depending on who held the pen. She moved quietly through the house, her gloved fingers tracing the wallpaper, the smell of mildew thick in the air. The once grand plantation now felt hollow, stripped of its vanity. At the back of Caldwell's study, behind a crooked portrait of his father, she found a narrow door set into the panelling. Inside lay shelves stacked with ledgers bound in cracked leather, pages yellowed by candle smoke. Her hands trembled as she opened one. Lines of ink marked the exchange of souls, names, ages, prices. Elara Mae, quince centavos. She pressed her hand to the entry, feeling her pulse drum beneath her skin. Behind her, the floor creaked. "Paper won't save you," said a voice. She turned. Reverend Blythe stood in the doorway, his face pale with righteous hunger. "I warned you," he said softly, "that curiosity is the devil's snare." Evelyn's throat went dry. "And I told you," she replied, "that faith without mercy is no faith at all." The preacher stepped closer. In his hand, a small silver flask gleamed. "This wine is blessed," he said. "Perhaps you should taste redemption before judgment falls." She realized then what he meant to do, not in time to stop him. The blow came sudden, a shove that sent her stumbling against the desk. The flask spilled, its contents burning on her lips. Not wine. The scent told her immediately, laudanum and something bitter. Her knees buckled, the ledgers blurred before her eyes. She fell against the wall, breath shallow, vision narrowing to a pin of light. Blythe's voice came through the haze, calm and cruel. "The Lord forgives the obedient, Mrs. Hartwell. You could have been among them." Her hand fumbled for the nearest book, the paper tearing under her fingers. She pulled a single page, Elara's receipt, and stuffed it into the hollow between two bricks at the base of the wall. Her last act, a confession the earth itself might one day return. When morning came, the servants found her seated upright, her eyes open, her face peaceful, as if she'd simply fallen asleep while reading. The preacher delivered her eulogy 2 days later. His voice did not tremble once. After Evelyn Hartwell's death, something inside Josiah Caldwell began to rot faster than the world around him. His body remained upright, his voice steady in public, but behind closed doors, the man unraveled piece by piece. The estate, once the pride of Henrico County, fell into quiet ruin. Fields went fallow. Tools rusted in the rain. The enslaved whispered that the earth itself had turned against its master. He no longer left the house. Curtains stayed drawn, candles burned at all hours. The servants brought him food he rarely touched, and those who lingered too long in his presence said his eyes looked hollow, as if something else had moved in behind them. At night, he paced the halls with a lantern, listening. The tapping began faintly, like a small creature trapped in the walls. Then came the voice, soft, distant, almost kind. It spoke his name, the syllables drawn out like a hymn. Josiah. He told himself it was his imagination. But when he ordered the walls torn open, no creature was found. The workmen refused to stay after sundown, muttering about a woman's whisper beneath the hammer blows. One evening, a storm rolled in from the east, thick with thunder. Caldwell sat in his study, a glass of untouched whiskey trembling in his hand. The fire had burned low, throwing more shadow than light, and in that dimness he saw her. Elara Mae, standing by the window, her dress soaked, her eyes fixed on him with terrible calm. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The only sound was her voice, soft and clear. "You wrote my price," she said. "Now I'll write yours." The lamp shattered. The flame leapt, caught the curtains, and within moments the study was aflame. Servants dragged him out half-conscious, his hair singed, his face blistered. He lived, but the house did not. For days afterward, the smell of smoke clung to the ruins like a warning. Caldwell ordered a new wing built over what remained, determined to bury the past under fresh paint and prayer. But the tapping continued, now louder, now closer, always 3 knocks, slow and deliberate. When the builders laid the new bricks, one man found a loose page wedged deep inside the old foundation. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. Elara Mae, 15 cents. He brought it to Caldwell. The master snatched it, trembling, and stuffed it into the fire. The paper curled, blackened, turned to ash, and from the smoke came a sound like laughter. That night, as the storm broke again across the fields, the old man collapsed at his desk, his pen scratching a final unfinished line. "She will not be silent." When the servants found him in the morning, his heart had stopped. On the wall above him, soot had formed the faint outline of a woman's hand. A century passed before anyone spoke the name Elara Mae again. By 1938, the Caldwell estate was gone, its ashes scattered beneath new farms and railroad tracks. The courthouse in Richmond County still stood, though its walls leaned with age and damp. That summer, the state ordered renovations, new paint, new flooring, a new record room for the archives of the past. Samuel Grant, 32 years old and proud of his meticulous handwriting, was hired to catalogue the old ledgers. He was not a superstitious man. He believed in process, in facts, in the crisp sound of paper being flattened against a table. To him, the dead belonged in ink, not memory. The first week passed without incident. Dust and boredom were his only companions. Then, on the morning of August 11th, a workman pried loose a section of plaster from the north wall of the records room. Something thin fluttered out and landed near Samuel's shoes. He bent to pick it up. It was a folded slip of parchment, browned at the edges, the writing faded but legible. The clerk's hand, though trembling, had been precise. Elara Mae, 15 cents. Beneath it, a signature. Josiah Caldwell. Samuel frowned. 15 cents. That can't be right. He called out to the foreman, but the man only shrugged. "Old court records," he said. "They used to log livestock, property, all sorts of things." Samuel turned the page over. The ink had bled through, faintly showing a second line, written in a different hand. It wasn't part of the record. It read, "She will not be silent." The words chilled him more than the draft creeping through the broken wall. He slipped the page into a protective folder and carried it to his desk. That night, he stayed late to copy the entry. The courthouse was empty, the air thick with the scent of varnish and dust. When he dipped his pen and began to write, the lights flickered once, then steadied. Somewhere in the corridor, he thought he heard a soft tapping, 3 knocks, slow and even. He paused, listening. Nothing. Only the rain starting against the windows, but when he returned to the desk, the original parchment had moved. It lay open now, though he hadn't touched it. The name seemed darker, the ink fresher, as if written only moments before. Samuel closed the file, locking it away. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd interrupted something, that the paper hadn't fallen out of the wall, but through it. Outside, thunder rolled over the city, just as it had 100 years before, and somewhere between the crash and the echo, a faint voice seemed to whisper his name, stretching it like a breath drawn too long. Samuel. He looked up. The lights flickered again. For the next several days, Samuel Grant could think of little else. The slip of parchment lay locked inside his desk drawer, but its presence pressed on him like a weight he couldn't shift. During daylight, surrounded by workers hammering and sanding, He convinced himself it was only curiosity that bothered him. But at night, when the courthouse stood empty, the air itself seemed to remember. He began to research the name, Elara Mae. The courthouse archives had no record of her, nor of any Caldwell estate within Richmond County. He drove to Henrico on his day off, combing through brittle papers in the clerk's office. There, hidden in a file labelled Property and Human Holdings, 1830 to 1840, he found a single reference. Sale executed to Josiah Caldwell, March 3, 1838. No further detail, no mention of death or freedom. A century of silence, wrapped around 15 cents. When he returned to the courthouse that evening, the janitor had already left. The echo of his own footsteps followed him through the corridors. He unlocked his office and flicked on the lamp. The light came slow, sputtering. The air felt colder than usual. He sat, staring at the drawer where the parchment was kept. He told himself he would look at it one last time, catalogue it, file it, and forget it. But when he opened the drawer, the folder was no longer sealed. The page lay open, the ink faintly glistening. It shouldn't have been possible. Samuel touched the edge carefully. The moment his fingers brushed the parchment, a sudden ringing filled the room, not loud, but sharp, like a tuning fork struck too close to the ear. He jerked his hand back. The lamp dimmed, flared, and then steadied again. His pen had rolled off the desk. When he bent to retrieve it, he froze. On the floorboards beneath the desk, in the layer of dust undisturbed for years, were 3 small indentations, like the marks of fingertips pressing down. He straightened, breath unsteady. "It's just the boards," he muttered, but his voice sounded foreign, too loud. That night, he dreamed of a woman standing in the rain outside a courthouse window. She said nothing, only held up her hand, palm marked with black ink. When he woke, the room still smelled faintly of smoke and old paper. The next morning, he sought help from a local historian, Clara Louise Whitfield, a woman known for restoring lost archives and the patience to decipher what time tried to bury. When he showed her the parchment, she traced the letters with her gloved hand and looked up, frowning. "This ink," she said slowly, "isn't just iron gall. There's blood in it." Samuel stared at her. "Human?" She didn't answer right away. "Whoever wrote this," she said softly, "wanted to be remembered, no matter what it cost." The discovery consumed them both. For Samuel Grant, it began as historical curiosity. For Clara Louise Whitfield, it became something closer to devotion. The parchment had awakened a hunger neither could explain. They met after hours, spreading documents across the long oak table in the records room, their lamplight flickering against the walls that now seemed to listen. Clara had a gift for finding what others overlooked. One night, after tracing the faint watermarks on the parchment, she said quietly, "This isn't courthouse stock." This kind of paper was used for personal ledgers, or for confessions. Her eyes lifted to his. "We're missing the other half of the story." 2 days later, she found it. She had gone to an abandoned church outside Richmond, one that had once been part of Reverend Blythe's parish. The basement, long forgotten and heavy with mildew, had been used as storage for hymnals and communion records. There, tucked inside a hymnal's broken spine, lay a bundle of sealed envelopes wrapped in faded ribbon. On the outermost, written in elegant cursive, were the words, "E. Hartwell, for when God is silent." Inside were 5 letters, dated 1838, the final one written only days before her death. Clara brought them to the courthouse, her gloves trembling as she unfolded the brittle pages. The first letter described the sale, Elara's calm defiance, the cruelty of the price, the way the parchment looked lighter than air but carried the weight of sin. The second told of Evelyn's visits to the plantation, her meeting with the blacksmith, and the plan to free the woman and her child. The third letter darkened. Evelyn wrote of Reverend Blythe's sermons, of Caldwell's decline, of her fear that the law itself was a noose disguised as justice, but it was the 4th and 5th letters that silenced the room. In the 4th, Evelyn confessed, "If the Lord has abandoned these people, then I will sin until he returns. I will write her freedom with my own hand and bear the punishment gladly." The fifth was almost illegible, the ink smudged by tears or sweat. I have hidden the truth where no one will look, in the courthouse wall, beneath the very seat of law. Let the stones remember what men choose to forget. When Clara finished reading, the room was still. Outside, rain began to fall against the window panes, soft but insistent. Samuel leaned back, his heart pounding. She knew, he whispered. She knew what they'd done, and she buried it here. Clara nodded, her expression grave. Maybe not just paper. Maybe something more. At that moment, from the far corner of the records room, came the faint sound of a hymn. No words, just a woman's voice humming through the walls, soft as breath and older than memory. For the next several weeks, the courthouse became more than Samuel Grant's workplace. It became his obsession. The more he and Clara uncovered, the more it seemed that time itself was conspiring to return the truth. Every page they read, every scrap of parchment unearthed, wove the same names together like a thread refusing to break. Late one afternoon, Samuel sat at his desk surrounded by the letters. His eyes burned from reading, but he couldn't stop. On one of Evelyn Hartwell's drafts, barely visible in the margin, he found a name written in lighter ink, Grace Turner. The pen had pressed hard into the paper, the indentation deep enough to suggest the words were carved more than written. He took the page to Clara. "This isn't random," he said. "It's the child, the one she said they sent north." Clara's brow furrowed. If that's true, she would have been born around 1838. Maybe she lived. Maybe her descendants did too. That night, they searched census records by lantern light, scrolling through reels of microfilm and hand-copied registries. The name appeared once, faint but clear, in an 1860 abolitionist report from Pennsylvania. Grace Turner, colored, aged 21, midwife, born Virginia. Clara exhaled. She made it. It wasn't joy that filled the room, but something heavier, a reverent silence, as if they'd heard a voice cross a century just to answer. Samuel leaned back, the parchment trembling in his hands. "If she lived," he murmured, "then everything that happened here, all the pain, all the death, it wasn't for nothing." But even as he spoke, a shadow moved across the lamplight. The air thickened, and the flame began to flicker violently. A sound rose from the far end of the room, 3 slow knocks, measured and deliberate. Clara froze. "Did you—" He shook his head, standing. "It's coming from the old file closet." They approached together, the floorboards creaking beneath their weight. The knocking stopped. Then, faintly, a woman's voice, soft, fractured, whispered through the wood. "Find her name." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Samuel, this isn't just history anymore." He tried to speak, but words failed. He reached for the closet handle, hand trembling. Inside was only darkness and the cold. Papers fluttered from a high shelf, swirling through the air as if pushed by unseen hands. One sheet landed against his chest. It was a church birth record from Henrico County, unsigned, dated March 1838. Infant female, unnamed. Mother Elara. Father unrecorded. But scrawled faintly at the bottom, in handwriting they both recognized, was a single line. "She will find her voice." Clara backed away, pale. "It's her. She's guiding us." Samuel folded the page, his voice steady but hollow. "Then we keep going." Until every word she wrote is seen behind them, the lights flickered once more, and somewhere deep in the courthouse, the sound of a baby's cry echoed faintly through the hall. By the end of September, the courthouse no longer felt like a building. It felt like something breathing, slow, steady, and aware. Every sound carried meaning now. The creak of a door, the hum of the old radiators, the way papers seemed to shift on their own when no one was near. Samuel Grant stopped trying to explain it. He simply recorded it. In his logbook he noted patterns. 3 knocks at 3:03 a.m., the same hour every night, light flicker duration, 6 seconds, temperature drop, 7 degrees. He documented it all as if cataloguing a haunting could tame it. but nothing could tame what followed. That Thursday, as the clock struck 3, Samuel sat alone at his desk. The air grew heavy, thick enough that even breathing felt like trespass. The sound began again. 3 knocks, steady, rhythmic. He turned toward the wall where the parchment had first been found. The plaster there had begun to crack. A thin line ran down its center like a wound trying to open. The whisper came next, faint but clear, moving through the room like breath. "The truth shall make you free." Samuel froze. It wasn't just a voice. It was a phrase he knew, one Evelyn Hartwell had written in her letters, quoting the Book of John. He rose, heart pounding, and stepped closer to the wall. His reflection in the window showed his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the plaster. The moment his fingertips brushed the surface, every clock in the courthouse stopped. The silence that followed was complete, so perfect it felt wrong. Then came the smell, smoke and damp earth, old wood and ash. He stumbled back, covering his mouth. The wall pulsed once, like something inside was trying to breathe. He bolted from the room, running down the corridor, the sound of his shoes echoing against the tile. But even as he fled, the tapping followed him, up the stairwell, along the walls, until it seemed to come from inside his own chest. At dawn, Clara found him sitting on the courthouse steps, pale and shaking, his notes scattered around him. "It's her," he said hoarsely. "She's trapped in the record." Every time someone writes her name, she moves closer. Clara knelt beside him, her eyes wide. "Trapped?" She said the law made her paper, not flesh. "We have to undo it. We have to find the freedom papers Evelyn forged." She looked toward the courthouse doors, where faint smoke marks still streaked the wood. "If they're still in there," she whispered, "we'll need to break the wall open." Samuel turned to her, the rising sun painting his face in gold and shadow. "Then we break it," he said, "and this time the law stays silent." Behind them, the courthouse clock shuddered once and began to tick backward. They returned after midnight, armed not with courage but necessity. The courthouse was empty, its corridors long and echoing like the inside of a tomb. Rain tapped softly against the high windows, the only sound that felt alive. Samuel Grant carried a crowbar. Clara Louise Whitfield held a lantern, and Evelyn Hartwell's final letter folded tight in her pocket like a prayer. They didn't speak much as they walked. Words had begun to feel dangerous here, as if sound itself carried weight. When they reached the records room, the wall looked unchanged at first glance, same cracks, same faded plaster, but the air around it pulsed faintly, warm and cold all at once, as though the building itself was breathing. Samuel set the crowbar against the seam and looked at Clara. "Once we do this," he said quietly, "we can't put it back." She met his gaze, steady despite the fear in her eyes. Neither could they. The first strike echoed through the courthouse like a gunshot. Dust filled the air, dry and bitter. The second blow brought a small chunk of plaster to the floor. By the third, the faint outline of a hollow began to appear, a rectangle about the size of a ledger. The lantern light flickered, throwing the room into shadow. A gust of wind rose from nowhere, swirling the papers on Samuel's desk. From the hollow in the wall came a faint sound, something sliding free. Clara reached in with trembling hands and pulled out a folded sheet wrapped in wax cloth, brittle but intact. She peeled it open slowly, her breath catching as the ink came into view. It was a manumission document, dated 1838. "Let it be known that Elara Mae, hereby and henceforth, is recognized as a free woman by act of manumission, witnessed and sealed by the hand of Josiah Caldwell." The signature was perfect, Caldwell's handwriting down to the slant and flourish. The forged seal glimmered faintly, untouched by time. Evelyn's act of defiance had survived a century. Clara's voice broke into a whisper. "She did it. She really did it." Samuel nodded, eyes wide. But the law never saw it. It stayed buried. She never knew the lantern flickered again. The air thickened with the scent of smoke and rain. And then they heard it, soft at first, then stronger. A woman's voice, clear and unbroken, reciting from memory, "Let my name be free." The light went out. Darkness swallowed them whole. When it returned, the document lay on the table untouched, but the signature had changed. The name below the seal no longer read Josiah Caldwell. It read Evelyn Hartwell. Clara's voice trembled. She claimed it at last. Outside, thunder rolled, shaking the windows. The courthouse doors burst open under the pressure of the storm, and somewhere deep inside the walls came the soft, unmistakable sound of a woman laughing through tears. Morning came grey and uneasy, the storm clouds still hanging low as if reluctant to leave. The courthouse smelled of damp stone and smoke, though no fire had touched it. Samuel Grant sat slumped at his desk, the manumission paper spread before him like a confession. The ink shimmered faintly, the new signature, Evelyn Hartwell, dark and fresh, as though written moments ago. Clara stood beside the window, watching the courthouse square come alive with the slow rhythm of another day. She hadn't spoken since dawn. When she finally turned, her voice was steady but thin. "We have to show it to someone. It's proof. A legal manumission. This could rewrite a chapter of history." Samuel shook his head. "History doesn't like to be rewritten. Especially not here." But before they could decide, the door swung open. A tall man in a dark suit stepped in, his expression carved from authority. The gold nameplate on his lapel caught the light. Judge Thomas Caldwell III. "Mr. Grant," he said smoothly, his voice carrying the calm weight of generations accustomed to being obeyed. "I received word you've uncovered certain historical materials. I'd like to review them before they leave this building." Samuel stiffened. "These are public records, Judge." "They belong to the state." The judge smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The state is not in the business of reviving ghost stories, especially those that might stain the memory of respected families." His gaze flicked toward the parchment. "My family included." Clara stepped forward. "This isn't about family, sir. It's about a woman who was enslaved, freed by act of conscience, and erased by law. That paper is truth, whether you like it or not." The judge's tone chilled. "Be careful, Miss Whitfield. The past has a way of swallowing the self-righteous." He reached for the document. Samuel's hand came down over it, firm and unyielding. "You can't bury this again," he said quietly. "It's already breathing." The judge leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Some things should stay buried, Mr. Grant. You open the door to the dead, you'd best be ready to live among them." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, somewhere above them, a sharp crack split the air, the sound of a light fixture snapping loose. It crashed to the floor between them, glass scattering like ice. The courthouse clock stopped. The judge flinched, eyes darting toward the ceiling. From the walls came a slow, deliberate tapping. 3 knocks. Clara's breath hitched. "She's here," she whispered. The judge's face drained of color. He turned abruptly and left without another word, the echo of his boots fading down the corridor. In the silence that followed, Samuel looked at the document again. The ink had begun to fade, as if its purpose was nearly complete. He spoke softly, almost reverently. The law tried to silence her. Now the law listens outside. The first break of sunlight pierced through the clouds, falling across the parchment like a benediction. By nightfall, the storm returned, not as rain this time, but as wind and thunder shaking the very bones of Richmond County. The courthouse groaned under the pressure, its windows rattling in their frames like the ghosts inside were begging to be let out. Samuel Grant and Clara Louise Whitfield stood in the records room, the manumission paper spread across the table between them. Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the old oak doors as though they were breathing in time with the storm. "The last time this happened," Clara whispered, "the Caldwell house burned." Samuel nodded. "Maybe that's what she's waiting for, the same reckoning." The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. The room fell into darkness, save for the lantern Clara held. Its flame bent violently, nearly extinguished by the gust of wind that poured through the cracks. The temperature dropped so suddenly their breath became visible, white mist in the dark. From somewhere deep within the courthouse came the sound, a chorus of footsteps, dozens of them, marching in rhythm. The boards creaked, the doors shook, and then silence. A single figure appeared at the end of the corridor, a woman in a plain muslin dress, soaked with rain that no longer fell. Her face was soft, calm, illuminated only by the stormlight outside. She looked exactly as she had in the faded sketch Samuel had found weeks ago, the woman on the bill of sale, Elara Mae. Her eyes met Samuel's, and every ounce of breath left his body. The air around her shimmered, rippling with faint whispers that seemed to come from every direction, hundreds of voices, layered and pleading, rising and falling like wind through trees. Clara clutched his arm. "She's not alone," she breathed. The lantern flame steadied, burning bright for one impossible moment. Then the courthouse erupted in light, not fire, not destruction, but memory. The walls flickered with moving images. The courthouse of 1838, the crowd, the sale, the gavel, Evelyn Hartwell standing in the doorway, the preacher's cruel mouth, Josiah Caldwell's trembling hand. And then, just as suddenly, the vision shifted. The same courtroom, but empty. The chains gone, the benches clean. Only Elara stood there, reading from the parchment Evelyn had forged. "Let my name be free." Each word echoed through the halls, shaking dust from the ceiling. The manumission paper on the table lifted into the air, caught in the invisible current, and for an instant the ink blazed gold. Samuel felt something inside him break open, the dam of history, of guilt, of silence. He fell to his knees, tears cutting through the dust on his face. When the light faded, the courthouse stood still again. The paper lay gently on the table, edges singed, ink gone. Only one thing remained, the faint outline of a hand pressed into the parchment, as though someone had touched it from the other side. Clara whispered, "She's done it." Samuel looked up, his voice barely audible. "No," he said, "she's only begun." The storm outside had quieted to a low, continuous hum, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Inside the courthouse, the air felt heavy and electric. Every wall, every floorboard seemed to wait for something, a final word, a last act. Samuel Grant and Clara Louise Whitfield stood by the long oak table, the remnants of the manumission document before them. The parchment was no longer whole. It had burned in strange, deliberate shapes, as if erased by invisible hands. In its center, only one word remained untouched by flame, Elara. Clara's voice broke the silence. "She's still here." And then came the sound, 3 knocks, slow and measured, reverberating through the floorboards. The air stirred, dust lifted, swirling in tiny spirals that caught the dim lantern light. The walls began to shimmer again, the plaster rippling like water disturbed by a hidden current. The door to the old courtroom creaked open on its own. They followed. Inside, the room was drenched in half-light, shadows deep enough to look alive. The judge's bench stood cracked with age, the witness box empty, the air filled with a low hum like the start of a hymn. And there she was, Elara Mae, standing at the center of the courtroom, the very space where she had once been sold. Her chains were gone. Her hands, translucent but steady, held the same bill of sale that had condemned her a century before. Samuel's heart hammered in his chest. He felt no fear, only sorrow, deep and aching. Elara raised the parchment. Her voice, when it came, was clear and resonant, echoing from wall to wall as though carried by all those who had ever been silenced. "This record declares me property. This record gave law to sin. This record named my worth in copper and ink." Her tone grew stronger, each word heavier, pulling the air tighter around them. "But I am not parchment. I am not ink. I am not silence." The parchment began to tremble, its edges curling. Light bled from its surface, not fire, not flame, but something pure, white and blinding. The writing dissolved line by line, until only her name remained, glowing in her hands. "Let my name be free," she said again, and this time her voice split the air like thunder. The parchment burst into light. A wind tore through the courtroom, flinging open every door and window. The sound was deafening, 1,000 whispers rising into one cry that was both mourning and release. When it ended, the parchment was gone. The courtroom was still. Clara stood weeping openly. Samuel could only whisper. She read her freedom aloud. Above them, the courthouse clock struck 3, but this time it did not stop. It began to tick forward again, and outside the storm broke into sunlight. In the weeks that followed, the courthouse returned to quiet routine, or so it seemed. Workers came and went, filing papers, painting walls, and pretending not to notice the smell of smoke that never quite left the records room. But for Samuel Grant and Clara Louise Whitfield, nothing was the same. The story had rooted itself in them, a living pulse they couldn't ignore. They spent long nights compiling every note, letter, and document they'd uncovered. The manumission record, what remained of it, was photographed and sealed. Evelyn Hartwell's letters were transcribed in full. The names, the dates, the cruelty and courage, all laid bare in a manuscript that Samuel titled The 15-Cent Woman. When Clara read the final draft aloud, her voice trembled. "This isn't a ghost story," she said softly. "It's a confession." Samuel nodded. "And the confession isn't ours." They sent the manuscript to a small Virginia press that specialized in forgotten histories. Weeks passed in silence, and Samuel began to think it would be buried again. But then a letter arrived. Acceptance. Publication set for spring. The editor's note was brief. "Truth this vivid does not age. It only waits." The book was released quietly, but it didn't stay quiet. Local papers picked up the story, first for its shock, then for its humanity. Historians debated its authenticity, pastors condemned it, and schools requested copies. Across the country, people read of Elara Mae, the woman sold for 15 cents, and the widow who had tried to save her. For the first time in a century, their names were spoken without shame, yet with recognition came anger. Descendants of the Caldwell family called it slander. Letters arrived at the courthouse, demanding the documents be sealed again. The new judge refused. "The law must face its ghosts," he told the reporters. All of them. One afternoon, as Samuel left the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered near the steps. An elderly woman stood at its center, holding a worn copy of the book pressed to her chest. She wore a simple locket around her neck, the metal polished thin with age. When she looked up at him, her eyes carried a depth that made his breath falter. "You wrote her name," she said quietly. "You gave her back her voice." Samuel managed a nod. "You knew of her." The woman smiled faintly. "My grandmother's name was Grace Turner. Her mother came from Virginia." The crowd fell silent. For a moment, even the wind seemed to stop. Samuel reached for her hand, his voice breaking. "Then she lived." "She did," the woman said. "And now she's been heard." As she walked away, the courthouse bell rang once, clear, solemn, and strangely alive. Years passed. The courthouse stood taller now, its stone washed clean, its halls repainted in bright whites and pale golds meant to forget the past. The renovations had erased every trace of soot, every cracked tile, every whisper of what had once happened there. But Samuel Grant knew better. Buildings didn't forget. They only learned to hide. He walked those halls again one quiet afternoon in late summer. He had retired from the archives years before, but something had drawn him back. A letter from the county clerk asking if he'd like to speak at a small dedication ceremony for the courthouse's centennial. He hadn't meant to accept, yet here he was, cane tapping softly against the floor, each step echoing through corridors that once shook with ghosts. In the main chamber, sunlight poured through tall windows, scattering against the polished floors. The air was still, and for the first time in years, the silence felt peaceful, not watchful. A plaque hung on the wall near the record room entrance, in memory of those whose names were erased. "Truth is the only justice time cannot destroy." Below it, cast in bronze, were two names, Elara Mae and Evelyn Hartwell. Samuel stood before it for a long while, his reflection wavering in the metal. "You did it," he whispered. "You both did." He turned toward the courtroom, the same one where the gavel had once sealed a soul for 15 cents. It had been rebuilt, restored, new benches, new lights, but when he stepped inside, a faint draft brushed his sleeve, and for a moment the air carried that familiar scent of rain and old paper. At the far end of the room, a group of schoolchildren sat listening to their teacher explain the memorial's meaning. "This is where Virginia's most mysterious case was rediscovered," she said. "Some say the woman who was sold for 15 cents still watches over this place to make sure truth is never forgotten again." A little girl raised her hand. "Is she a ghost?" The teacher smiled. "Maybe not a ghost. Maybe a voice." Samuel lingered in the back, a small smile tugging at his mouth. When the children left, their laughter fading down the hall, he walked to the judge's bench and rested a hand on the rail. The wood was warm, almost pulsing beneath his fingertips. 3 soft knocks sounded behind him, measured, familiar, not frightening. He turned, and for an instant the light through the windows took shape, the faint outline of a woman standing where the witness box used to be. Her gaze was calm, grateful. Samuel bowed his head. "Rest now," he murmured. When he looked up again, the shape was gone. Only sunlight remained, bright and clean across the floorboards. Outside, the bells began to ring for the ceremony, but Samuel stayed a little longer, his heart still, his purpose complete. Evening settled over Richmond County like the closing of a book. The courthouse bell rang its last note, echoing down streets lined with lamplight and memory. Samuel Grant stood outside on the courthouse steps, the bronze plaque gleaming behind him, the sound of crickets rising like an old hymn. He looked up at the windows above, where candlelight flickered faintly in the record room, a light no one had lit. He smiled. "Some stories never rest," he murmured. The air was warm, the kind of Virginia evening that smelled of dust and honeysuckle. Across the square, the descendants of those whose names had been buried now gathered every year on this night, the anniversary of the discovery. They brought flowers, sang hymns, and read aloud from the 15-cent woman. The voices of children carried down the street, soft and clear. "Let my name be free." Samuel took a seat on the bottom step, his cane resting against his knee. He was older now, slower, but his mind was sharp. He thought of Clara Louise Whitfield, who had passed 2 years earlier, her obituary reading, historian, truth-seeker, and friend to the forgotten. He thought of the elderly woman who'd once stood before him clutching the book, the descendant of Grace Turner. He wondered if she still kept that locket, if the voice of her ancestor still found her in dreams. And he thought of Elara Mae, whose courage had outlived everyone who tried to silence her. In the distance, thunder rolled faintly, not in warning, but as if the sky itself were nodding in acknowledgement. The wind shifted through the trees, and for a heartbeat, he thought he heard it again. That same soft humming, the melody of a hymn older than the courthouse itself. He whispered into the breeze, "You're free now." The courthouse lights flickered once, as though in answer. He rose slowly, leaving his notes on the step beside him, pages filled with neat handwriting, the beginnings of another story he would never finish. When he turned to go, the lamplight caught the bronze plaque once more. For an instant, the metal seemed to shimmer, the engraved names glowing faintly as if touched by unseen hands. Elara Mae, Evelyn Hartwell. The bell tolled again, 3 slow chimes. The same rhythm that had once haunted him now sounded like peace. He walked away as night gathered behind him, the courthouse standing still against the sky, proud and quiet, no longer a house of silence but of remembrance. And for those who would listen, through paper, through voice, through history, the story lived on. Because truth never dies. It waits. It whispers. It remembers. And when the world is ready to hear, it speaks again. So before you go, if you believe stories like this one should never be buried again, subscribe right now. Let these voices reach farther and tell me in the comments where you're listening from, your city, your state, your country. Because every name spoken, every place listening, keeps Elara Mae's voice alive.